Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a comparison between these three Canon cameras. We have the R8, the R6, and the R6 Mark II. The idea behind this video is to help you decide which one of these might be the right one for you if you're just starting out, but also if you already have an R6, should you upgrade to an R6 Mark II? And everything in this video is all from my real-world experience using each one of these cameras, because I've taken them out into the real world to shoot sports, portraits, videos, anything you can think of, we've done it with these cameras, and that's why this video is going to help you figure out which direction you should go. Now, let's jump right into the cameras, starting with the image sensors. The R8 has a 24.2 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor powered by a Digic X processor. The Canon R6 has a 20.1 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor powered by the same Digic X processor, and the R6 Mark II has a 24.2 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor powered by, guess what, a Digic X processor. Now would be a good time to tell you that the R8 and the R6 Mark II basically have the same innards. That's right, they have the same sensor, they have the same autofocus. We'll get to all of that as we go through this video, but just understand that a lot of what I say about these two cameras is basically going to be exactly the same, which makes the R6 the one that is slightly different here. The R6 right here has an older sensor. It was the sensor from the 1DX Mark III with some tweaks. That was a high-end DSLR, and 20 megapixels in today's world is not that much, but you can get fantastic results with it. But the newer 24 megapixel sensor in both of these cameras is fantastic. These cameras are very similar across the board, and that's why we're going to go over the specs to help you figure this out. In terms of ISO, they have the exact same ISO sensitivity. We have 100 to 102,400, native expandable up to 204,800. Now, I've recently used the R8 shooting basketball at 5,000 ISO indoors, and it's fantastic. I've pushed the R6 Mark II and the R6, and those are fantastic. You can really push these cameras much further, and of course a lot depends on the lenses that you're using, because the more light that you let in, the lower you can drop the ISO versus using maybe bad lenses or terrible aperture lenses where you have to really raise that ISO. You're going to start to see some issues the higher you go. So far I haven't given a check mark because there's not a lot of check marks to give, but from time to time we will go and give some check marks in these cameras. Now let's talk about frame rate. The R8 shoots at 6 frames per second with a first curtain electronic shutter. That means it does not have a full shutter going in there anymore. Like the old cameras, like boom, you hit the button, you get a shutter. This is just first curtain shutter. But in terms of electronic shutter, you can shoot up to 40 frames per second. You can also dumb it down to 20 frames per second as well as 5 frames per second, and that's in 12-bit RAW. You have pre-shooting RAW burst mode, which was introduced in the R6 Mark II. You have high-frequency flicker mode, HDR moving subject mode, and a few other things. Now, I mentioned these because it's kind of the same exact thing that you find in the R6 Mark II, but the difference is you get 12 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. So you have the full mechanical shutter here. Now, I know I skipped over this. We're going to come back to that in just a second, but again, the R6 Mark II and the R8 are very similar, just with the R6 Mark II giving you the 12 frames per second with a full mechanical shutter, whereas you just have the 6 frames per second with the first curtain shutter in this bad boy. Now, moving on to the R6, you have 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter in 12-bit RAW. You don't have the mode where you can knock it down to 5 frames per second with the electronic shutter, and you don't have 40 frames per second. Yeah, it's pretty insane to say that these two cameras give you 40 frames per second, which gives these each 40 check marks on the screen, which gives us 80 whole check marks. Dan, you can just put one big ass check mark on the screen if that makes it easier. Here's where there is a difference between the R8, the R6 Mark II, and the R6. It's the readout speed of the sensor. You have a slightly slower readout speed of the R6. Now, the R6 for shooting sports, it's a fully capable camera, and you don't really see much of an issue with the jelloing shutter or some lag happening, but it is there. When the R6 Mark II came out and gives you 40 frames per second, you are not really running into much of an issue with bowing or banding when it comes to shooting fast action. 40 frames per second is more than the Canon R3 does, which is a $6,000+ camera that only gives you 30 frames per second. Now, these are not stacked sensors. I didn't go into the details on that, but stacked sensors generally have a faster readout speed, which cuts down on the warping. For example, when you look at this tennis photo taken with the R6 Mark II, you can see that the tennis racket is warping because of the speed and the ball warps, but when you break out the R3 with a stacked sensor, you're not seeing it. But for most sports, I shot the R8 doing women's lacrosse. I did it with the Harlem Globetrotters, and I didn't really find any noticeable issues, which is fantastic when shooting 40 frames per second. Those are the differences. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this video is helping you decide, do you go with an R6 or do you end up going with an R8 at that point? Now, we're gonna get to all that by the very end, but I just wanna point out as much as I can here to help you make those decisions. Let me jump in here real quick because I wanna show you this photo taken with the Canon R8 and edited with 11 of the presets from FroPack 3, starting with Zoolander, followed by Winnebago. Then we've got Walter White, Prestige Worldwide, Mount Airy, Mentos, King Contrast, Eckert, Capone, Canadian Tuxedo, and Fifth Element. But check out my favorite preset of all time called Skittles. Boom, one click, and that's how good Skittles looks. So look, if you're looking to speed up your RAW workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're tired of presets just not working, ours work. We created 15 custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters. And if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or you could save even more by getting the triple play bundle that includes FroPack 1, 2, and 3, as well as Skittles. Now, let's get back to the video. Now, let's move on to the focusing modes. I'm gonna read the R6 Mark II and the R8 together here because they're basically the same. They incorporate the AF system from the R3 with an improved deep learning engine for better subject tracking with improved stickiness, dual pixel AF2, IAF, human, animal, vehicle, horses, airplane, and train autofocus. It has all of those different modes in the R6 Mark II and the R8 for helping track those subjects. Now, where these two differ is you have a joystick on the back of the R6 Mark II, and you don't have a joystick on the R8. And in my shooting with the R8, I have not missed the joystick. It's quicker to use a joystick sometimes, but there is a D-pad on the back, and I can move my focusing points. Now, what's interesting here is that the R8 has something that the R6 Mark II doesn't have, and that's you touch the back of the LCD screen when it's up to your eye to select the subject eye, or to select the subject that you want to, if you have multiple subjects in the frame. I'm assuming that a firmware update might add that to the R6 Mark II, but for now, you have the R8 having something that the R6 Mark II doesn't have. But remember, I said they have the R3's autofocus. You're talking about a $6,000+ camera. To have the autofocus in these cameras match that is insane, and I can tell you that it comes close to matching it, if not matching it at this point. Across the board, it's fantastic. Now, the R6 has dual pixel AF2, IAF, human, animal, and vehicle AF. It doesn't have all of the same algorithms that the other two cameras have. It also doesn't borrow as much from the R3. Is it great autofocus? The answer is yes. It's fantastic autofocus. Is it better than the R8's autofocus? The answer is no. It's not better than the R8's focus. Is it better than this? No, obviously not, because it's the same in both of these cameras. You still get great autofocus across the board. It's just gotten better quicker at this point, so keep that in mind when you're making your decision. Now, here's where we will find some differences. The R8 has a burst rate of up to 56 RAW files. Now, that's if you're at 100 ISO only, because when you go to higher ISOs, you start to drop the amount of frames you can get per second when you're shooting at 40 frames per second. For example, when I was doing lacrosse outside, I got roughly 41 to 43 frames per second with a burst. That's like 1 second of shooting, by the way, so you can outrun the buffer in this camera fairly quickly within a second. Now, if you're shooting in lower light situations, you end up getting less frames per second because there's more data, all right? So that's what all that means. Now with the R6, you're getting 240 RAW files in a burst. You're pretty much not going to outrun this. Part of that reason is you have the 20.1 megapixel sensor in this versus the 24. So you're not really going to outrun it, but you also have dual card slots in this bad boy. And the R6 Mark II is giving you 110 RAW files. So you know what, Steven? We're giving a check mark right now to the R6, this old boy, which is, by the way, only 2.5 years old. But it's getting a check mark because it can do more frames in a burst. Now, continuing on with something that is important when it comes to burst mode, we've got the type of SD card slots in these cameras. The R8 has one UHS-2 SD card slot, meaning it just has one slot, whereas the R6 has two slots. We have two UHS-2 SD slots, and you can write both photos and video to both of those cards, so you have redundancy, and you have the same exact thing here in the R6 Mark II. This is one of those differentiators that might make the difference between going with an R8 or an R6 or an R6 Mark II in your mind. Can you live with one card slot? Are you in a situation where if a card fails and blows up on you, well, you're out of luck? That's just something you have to take into consideration. I've been using the R8 and I've been using the higher end SD cards. I want to use the best cards possible, and also I want to use the fastest writing cards. You need a V90, an SD card that says V90 on it for the R8 if you want to get the fastest read and write speeds when it comes to shooting at 40 frames per second. You want it to write from the buffer to the card much quicker, and to clear the buffer quicker, you need the faster card. Do not buy cheap cards. Now's a good time to talk about that. Do not buy cheap cards. You don't want cheap cards in any camera. Buy reputable brands. You've got your ProGrade Digital. You have your SanDisk Professional. You have your Lexar. Sony makes cards. Those are going to be your professional types of cards. Just buy the higher end ones. Do not cheap out here. Now, personally, I like having two card slots, but at the end of this video, when we hear about the price of the R8, maybe you're gonna consider it. Maybe this is a backup to someone who has an R6 Mark II or an R5 or an R3, and this might be for you. But if you're new into this world and you're deciding what to do, just keep in mind, do you want two card slots? Do you want one card slot? What are the pros and cons to both? In this case, check marks go to these two cameras. Now let's talk about max shutter speeds. The R8 gives you a max shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second with the first curtain electronic, or in electronic shutter mode, you will get up to 1/16,000th of a second, which is fantastic to have if you're shooting with better glass, wider aperture lenses. You're able to shoot in brighter light at faster shutter speeds without having to put a ND or variable ND filter on top of your lens. That's great. The R6 gives you 1/8000th of a second with a mechanical and electronic shutter. That's more normal. That's what you would have seen in the DSLR days, 1/8000th of a second. Now, the R6 Mark II gives you the 1/8000th of a second with the mechanical, but also 1/16,000th of a second with the electronic. It's kind of insane that you can do that. Now, when I was shooting the R8 the first time, I'm like, oh, it's very bright out and I'm using an f2 lens and I'm at 1/4000th, but I can't go beyond that. So what did I do? I just went into electronic shutter mode and I could go to 1/16,000th and made it happen. That's insane that you can do that. It's great across the board with these, so no check marks going for this round. Let me jump in here and say, would you like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations? Well, if you said yes, just look for this orange box over on FroKnowsPhoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm gonna send you that guide for free. Now moving on to video. This is the big differentiator across the board between the R6 and the other two cameras. Now the R8 and the R6 II are very similar when it comes to video. So I'm gonna read you the R6 Mark II video here. One of the changes they made is that it's no longer just full manual or full auto as options. You have the options for AV, TV, etc., FV, all the different modes that they give you, whereas the original R6 was very limiting and you couldn't go into those other modes, which is still kind of mind-boggling that they limited it at that point. Now, you get full frame 4K UHD video with the R6 Mark II. You get video recording up to 60 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265, oversampled from 6K. Now, you get cropped Super 35 4K up to 60p with binning for extra reach. You have full raw output, which is the one thing that the R8 does not give you. Full frame 180 frames per second at 1080p. There's no record limit. You have C-Log 1 and 3, micro HDMI port, 5-second movie pre-recording, digital hot shoe for wireless, which is awesome, false color, focus breathing correction, new detect only AF mode, which is where the camera will wait to stop focusing if the subject leaves the frame. You have a new second Q cinema style menu as well. You have the same thing in the R8, you just don't have the raw output. Pretty amazing that the R8 gives you the same thing as the R6 Mark II for all intent and purposes. Now, the R6 has full auto or full manual recording modes, nothing in between like I just mentioned. You have full frame 4K UHD video recording at up to 60 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265. You're oversampled from 5.1K, full frame 120 frames per second at 1080p, and you have a record limit of 2959, C-Log 1 and 3, micro HDMI port, and the potential for some overheating, which might still be a thing when you're shooting video with the R6. We have not seen that with the R6 Mark II and the R8. So the biggest differences here is the video. If you're just thinking about stills and maybe you want to shoot some video, this is fine, the R6, but the fact that the R8 for less money, and we'll get to that at the end of this with the pricing, is pretty insane that these two match each other and have all of these different features, because a digital hot shoe is going to come in handy when you want to put in one of Canon's microphones that takes the digital audio and just puts it right into the camera without having to use a cable. Now, here's something the R8 doesn't have that the R6 and the R6 Mark II has is IBIS. In-camera stabilization. The sensor is not stabilized. Now, you do have an electronic movie digital stabilization, but that is going to crop into the sensor slightly to counteract any movement. So you don't have image stabilization. In the R6 and the R6 Mark II, you have 5-axis in-body stabilization up to 8 stops of IS with certain lenses, and 7 stops with most lenses when paired with lens IS. So you got image stabilization in these two bad boys right here. It's going to be the same. That is good. Image stabilization is great if you're shooting video, you're running and gunning. If you're shooting at much slower shutter speeds, that's going to come in handy. But again, I want to remind people that I was shooting the R8 when I was doing basketball, and I'm at like 1/1000th or faster of a shutter speed. And people are like, was your IS, was the lack of IS hurting you? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Remember that image stabilization does not freeze the subjects that you're shooting. If you shoot at a slower shutter speed, it's going to counteract your movement. So if you're at 1/10 of a second, which is a slow shutter speed, and a subject is going across the frame, it's not going to freeze them. It's just going to counteract your movement. So in most situations, it's not that big of a deal. In video situations, it really is, but also know you can put lenses with IS built in. You're not going to get the full 8 stops of image stabilization, but you're still going to get image stabilization with those IS lenses. Now let's move into talking about the body. The R8 is an insanely small full frame body. It's basically the same size as the Canon RP. It has all of the innards that we find in the R6 Mark II, sans some of the things we've already talked about, but it does lack a few things. Now, it's a body with minimal buttons. There's no joystick. It does have a movie photo mode switch. Now, it has no shutter in there. Remember, it doesn't have a full shutter, a full mechanical shutter, which means when you turn the camera off, it doesn't drop a shutter down to protect the sensor. Now, I'm not a big fan of that because every time you turn the camera off, the shutter would have to come down. Every time you turn it on, it has to come up, and it's not instant. If it was instant, I wouldn't care. That'd be fine. You can come and protect it. In this case, this camera does not offer you that. Now, the R6 and the R6 Mark II, basically the same thing. The body feels fantastic in the hands. You have the joystick. The buttons are basically in the same place. One of the only differences is that the R6 has the on-off switch on the left-hand side, whereas the R6 Mark II has the video to photo mode on the left-hand side and moves the on and off switch to the top right portion of the camera. Other than that, they're basically the same feeling camera. Now, one thing that does differentiate these two things from the R8 is that you can get a grip. A battery grip with vertical shooting capability. You can put that onto both the R6 and the R6 Mark II. The R8 does not offer you one of these, but they do offer you a small little grip that just extends it a little bit. It doesn't offer you anything mechanical or electronic. It just allows your pinky to go somewhere because it's such a small camera. So is there a check mark given to any of these cameras, Steven?
Yes.
Really? Which one?
R6 Mark II and R6.
Okay, Steven says R6 Mark II and the R6 get check marks this time around. At the end of the day, the R8 still feels fantastic in your hands, except if you're huge and you have huge hands, it might feel a little tiny in your hands. So just take that into consideration when you're deciding between these cameras. Let me jump in here real quick and let you know that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your very own online portfolio, use what I use for my personal website at jaredpolin.com because it's simple, easy, affordable, and I don't need to know coding. You can have galleries up in 5 minutes or less. If you want to get a 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto. If you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Next up, we have the electronic viewfinder. We have a 2.36 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate in the R8. The R6 Mark II and the R6 both have a 3.69 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate. I didn't have an issue with the R8's EVF at all when I was using it. It didn't seem like it was less quality or lower quality or that shooting sports was an issue. The viewfinder itself is smaller. The magnification that's in there is smaller. So it's a little more, you have to put your eye directly into this thing and look through the middle of it, because when you look through the edges, it might just skew some things a little bit, but it didn't cause me to miss any shots. Do I like a bigger and brighter viewfinder? Sure, but it wasn't a big deal here. Even with less resolution, it was perfectly fine for me. The screens on the back of these cameras are exactly the same. You have a 3-inch, 1.62 million dot vari-angled touchscreen. That means they all flip out and rotate, so whichever one you use, it's gonna be exactly the same, and that is a pretty good screen. Now let's move on to batteries. The R8 has a smaller LPE17 battery, but it does allow you to do some USB charging. When I was shooting lacrosse, women's lacrosse outdoors, it was like 28 degrees and snowing. I went through a whole battery while shooting, and I needed to go into a second battery. That was after about 800 or 900 shots. When it's colder, you're gonna get less life out of your battery. So if you do go with an R8, just understand less battery power, smaller battery means you won't be able to shoot as long. You might want to have 2 or 3 extra batteries, at least 1 extra battery when you're out shooting. And I would probably invest in a USB-C charger for any of these cameras, just so it's like a phone charger. You could charge your phone. You could also plug it into the camera to give it extra juice or to keep it powered while you're shooting. That's another option that you have. Now with the R6 and the R6 Mark II, you have the LPE6NH battery, and you do have the USB charging with these as well. Bigger battery, more power, it's gonna last longer, but that all comes with responsibility of a bigger body. That's why this is a smaller body. The R8 weighs in at 1 pound or 461 grams. The R6 weighs in at 1.5 pounds or 680 grams, and they shave some weight off with the R6 Mark II by making it 1.3 pounds or 588 grams. They all are light feeling cameras. Now, of course, the R8 is small and tiny and feels great in the hands, and it has less weight, but across the board, these all weigh not a ton, and they do feel nice in the hands. The price and wrap up to this video is what it's all about. The R8 is priced at $1,499 for a full frame camera. The R6 currently on sale at $2,099, with the R6 Mark II coming in at $2,499. You have a $1,000 difference between the R8 and the R6 Mark II. Now we know that you can still get the R6 new at $2,099. Should you do that? My answer to buying that new is no. If you want an R6, the reason you would go with an R6 over an R8 might be the bigger battery and the dual card slots. That might be enough for you. You might be able to find one of these between $1,600 and $1,700 or $1,800 used. If that's the case, it's not a bad option. The R6 Mark II at $2,500, fantastic. The quality of what it gives you is insane. All of the specs that I mentioned, honestly, the 40 frames per second is fantastic. But the difference between the R8 and the R6 Mark II is not a lot. Same sensors, same shooting capabilities, except for the 6 frames a second with the first curtain electronic, the single card slot, the dual card slot in this bad boy. To me, this is a race between, do you go with an R8 or an R6 Mark II? If you're a full-time professional, you're someone who's already shooting weddings, you're shooting sports, you want the 40 frames per second, you can afford the extra $1,000, the R6 Mark II is absolutely the way to go. If you're just getting into the world of full frame photography, you're new, you're gonna do portraits, you're gonna do landscapes, you wanna catch all camera, you maybe wanna make money with it. You can make money with any camera, I should definitely say that. But if you wanna save some money, the R8 is a great option, because you can take that extra $1,000 and put it into glass. Because I rather have an R8 with better glass than an R6 Mark II with terrible glass. It's always glass, 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 glass. The better the glass, the better opportunity for better images you have. That's always been the way, in my opinion, and that's what I practice in everyday life. The R8 is amazing. If you can't get past a smaller battery and you can't get past the fact that it has only one card slot, then maybe you don't go there and you look for something like an R6. But it's hard to point people in the direction of the R6 at this point, especially if you're gonna shoot action, because you're getting 40 frames per second. You're getting a faster readout speed with the R8 and the R6 Mark II. They're both great. Now, all of that I just said is really geared towards the still shooter. When it comes to video, I wouldn't even look at the R6 at this point. The R8 is gonna give you more for less money. No, you don't have the IBIS built in, so keep that in mind, but still, the better quality of the video that you're gonna get from both of these cameras is why I would lean towards those. Now, if you're someone who has an R6 and you're trying to decide, do you upgrade to an R6 Mark II or do you go and downgrade to an R8? Well, you gotta ask yourself, full-time professional, not full-time professional. Really, if you're not, there's no reason to upgrade this. If this is giving you everything that you need, I mean, yeah, it's 2.5 years old, still a great camera. It's gonna be a great camera for many years to come. If it's not something that you're full into professionally, there's no reason to not have this. Go buy some more glass, right? Now, I have a friend who shoots a lot of sports and she had an R6 and she's like, should I get an R3 or an R6 Mark II? And I was like, I don't really think you need an R3. I mean, you could buy 3 of these for the price of one of those. I don't know why you would even consider, 3 of the R8s for the same price, but I think an R6 Mark II might be a better upgrade for you right now for that 40 frames per second with the faster readout speed. And her feedback right after using the R6 Mark II the first time to shoot sports was, wow, you can actually notice a difference in the autofocus. So if you're a sports shooter, you want to upgrade, keep this as your backup or sell it for $1,500, $1,600, $1,700, do that, roll into the R6 Mark II because this is a fantastic camera. Honestly, Canon's done a fantastic job across the board. So let me know what you guys think. Which would you go with and why? Thank you very much for watching. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.